Prehistoric Kingdom recently released its newest update, that being update 15, and while it added a whole bunch of stuff, such as new dinosaurs, new food trays, and updated behavior, as well as nesting and reproduction, what I really want to talk about now is the Paleobotany. So why is this so important for the game? To understand that, we first have to understand that the animals were not the only thing that were vastly different during the Mesozoic. When it comes to the animals, they're mostly defined by what is not around anymore, so the creatures that went extinct, like the non-avian dinosaurs. With the plants, it's almost the other way around, where many of the plants that we have today just simply didn't exist yet. To understand that, we first have to understand a little bit about how plants are related to each other and how they evolved. Now, plants can be separated into different classes, just as well as animals. So just like we have mammals, reptiles, etc., we do have different plant groups or plant classes, such as the spore plants, which are the more primitive plants that have been around for quite some time, stuff like ferns or horsetails. But really the most important group for us today are the gymnosperms and especially the angiosperms. Now, gymnosperms include stuff like conifers, ginkgos, and the cycads, which are palm lookalikes but are not really palms, as well as some other species, some of which we will see today in this video because they were actually added to the game. The gymnosperms have existed since the Carboniferous and were especially at their peak during the Mesozoic. Now, however, the angiosperms are a different story because they are pretty much the thing that differentiates the modern day from the time of the dinosaurs, or the non-avian dinosaurs. Angiosperms are flowering plants, and they reproduce through pollination. Angiosperms evolved somewhere in the Triassic or Jurassic, but they only became widespread throughout the Cretaceous. Many species that are alive today evolved long after the Cretaceous. And this, for example, goes for a lot of very recognizable modern plants, such as a lot of desert plants, for example, cacti, agaves, aloes, but also a lot of deciduous trees, such as oak trees, beech trees, birch trees, tropical trees, such as fig trees or kapok, as well as pretty much everything we eat. So vegetables, fruit, herbs, just all that stuff, spices, all that stuff just evolved after the dinosaurs already went extinct and after most of the species that we have in the game existed. This also goes for grass, for example. While grasses started to evolve in the late Cretaceous, they only really became widespread after the KPG extinction. And the wide open grasslands that we see today in so many places just simply did not exist yet. Now, all of this means that if we want to make landscapes for our dinosaurs, whether it's in enclosures or in actual reconstructions of these ecosystems of the past, we need a lot more plants than what we have in the game right now. The plants that we have in the game right now are largely modern plants that did not exist in the Mesozoic. There are, of course, some exceptions and some plants that I'll talk about later on that are not in this update but are still very useful for us, but already were. But when it comes to the vast majority of modern plants and modern landscapes, they are relatively new and did not yet exist in the Mesozoic. And this is why this update is just so important. To recreate actual prehistoric landscape, we need prehistoric plants. And to make enclosures for animals that lived in prehistoric times, to at least make them somewhat convincing and immersive, you want to use the plants that these animals actually coexisted with. If you make a zoo enclosure for an animal, you try to build it in a similar way to the natural environment of this animal. You will not place a tiger in a desert enclosure or a lion in a dense jungle enclosure. Instead, you will try to recreate the enclosures of the animals that, or of the environment that the animal actually exists in. So now I want to talk a little bit about the plans that the update gave us. Now, first of all, I highly recommend checking out the Paleobotany guide by Teutonicus. I've used this also extensively to research for this video. I try to link it in the description because it's just very helpful, and he basically talks about the different plants in the game and in what context they can be used. Now, to start off, we first of all have this little fern here, which is from Antarctica, Australia. Yeah, so nothing special. It's just a fern with these almost coal-shaped leaves, and very nice little fern. There's this variant with a bit more yellowish leaves. Now, much more interesting are these ones. They are called Arthotaxites, and today they only grow in Tasmania. And the interesting thing is that while they are considered alpine trees because they grow in relative high altitudes, they still do not like the cold that much. Well, first of all, they need a lot of water and they need mild winters. So they would survive in places like the British Isles and like maybe Sweden or the Californian redwood. All this considered, I would rather say that these fit a bit more into the coastal biome than into the boreal biome. That being said, I understand that they wanted to have just more than one plant from this biome, but not having that many coastal plants makes sense if you consider that, first of all, the Mesozoic was significantly warmer than today, and also we have a lot of conifers from the main game, it's not a main game because it's all the main game, it's not a DLC or anything, but from before the update. So all of these conifers, if you want to do something like the Prince Creek Formation, which is probably the coldest setting that we have in the Mesozoic, you can still get away with that with just these trees fine enough. So yeah, these ones are pretty much useful for most of the most of the Cretaceous and early Jurassic, and basically even before that, they are very basic cypresses. Not the oldest one, we'll get to that, but yeah, they also look very similar to a lot of other cypresses, such as redwood, giant redwood specifically. So overall, very useful plants, very nice to have. Probably one of my favorite plants from this update. I will use them excessively in all types of settings, even post-Cretaceous, because they just look very generic for conifers. So next up, we move on to the coastal biome. First of all, we have this little fern. It's very similar to the bracken in appearance, and yeah, ferns were very common throughout the Mesozoic. So pretty much nothing special, but very nice to have, especially because of the roots. I really love the roots on this one. And if you turn it upside down, you can actually just use the roots as, well, roots. If you make a forest and you want to have roots on the floor, this is the plant that you can very well use for that. Next up, we have this one. Ibuinia. I'm not trying to pronounce all of the names because, I mean, you can read them if you want. You can check how they're called in the game if you want. But some of them have really hard to pronounce names. Now, this is a cycad known today from Northern Australia, or their relatives are known from Northern Australia. They look very fern-like, but that's kind of normal for cycads. So yeah, just a plant for dense forests. These ones are also related to cycads, and they're very weird looking because they have these branches, and they have these relatively full leaves. So instead of having these palm fronds that cycads generally have these very big leaves, kind of very similar to banana plants. They will also grow from most of the Cretaceous and in a lot of environments, even slightly colder environments, despite the fact that they look a bit more tropical, at least for me, probably because of this resemblance to banana plants. But yeah, these are very nice looking. And despite the fact that they are from the Cretaceous, I think they also would work well even in the Triassic, because cycads were already common back then. This makes sense considering, yeah, they just look very exotic and very prehistoric for me. So a very cool plant to have. Same goes for this one. This is another tree fern. Now, of course, at this point, we have to remember that we already have a lot of plants in the base game that you can still use for Mesozoic settings. Most of the ferns, especially the tree ferns, and most of the conifers are very useful in different parts of the Mesozoic, like pine trees and pine-like trees and stuff like this. Yeah, also a very nice fern. Looks kind of similar to the thought fern, I think, but it has these stalks in the middle. Now let's talk a bit about the trees. Now this is a tree called Elatides. This is also a cypress, just like these ones, but it's one of the oldest groups of cycads. Now it's very closely related to a modern tree called the Chinese fir or the China fir, and they are very ancient. They have existed from the early Jurassic onwards. They, for example, have been very common in the Morrison Formation. For those of you who don't know, the Morrison Formation contains a lot of famous taxa such as Allosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Brontosaurus, the Torvosaurus, Dryosaurus, Ceratosaurus, what the game's Stegosaurus. So yeah, very useful plant on that, simply because they are so versatile and usable for pretty much all of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, because they have also been present in the Hell Creek as far as I know. Same for the ginkgo. Now finally we have ginkgos in the game. This was one of my most anticipated plant, because apart from conifers, we didn't really have any trees that could be used in the wider Mesozoic, since deciduous trees pretty much only appear in the Cretaceous. So for the Jurassic and Triassic, we needed something else, and ginkgos is that something else. Now there's two species of ginkgos, or two versions of ginkgos, as you can see here. This is the older one. So this would be used in the Triassic or early Cretaceous. Now, sadly, I think these look not as good as the other ones. They do not quite have the high resolution. And one thing that bothers me about this one is that the small one, the sapling, has these extremely small leaves, to the point where if you just make it larger, it just looks like... Oh, I think it's even this one. Yeah, this is the smaller one. So if you just make it larger, it just looks like a normal large tree, because the leaves are just so tiny. The leaves of a young tree should be roughly the same size of the older trees, just that the tree itself is smaller. So this is kind of an error, if you want. But overall, these are very nice, especially for Jurassic and late Triassic and even early Cretaceous settings. You can see the difference between the ginkgos by the shape of the leaves. Now, these older ginkgos have these split leaves, so instead of one solid leaf, they have these several split leaves. If we move on to the other ginkgo, we of course see that this one has the fan-shaped leaves that we know from modern ginkgo. And they also have a tad different growth shape, where these newer ginkgos, these can really only be used in the late Cretaceous. So like Hell Creek and Namak and stuff like that. And these also have a much more tree-like appearance. So they have this relatively round shape that deciduous trees have, while these ones still look more like conifers. For those of you who don't know, ginkgos are closely related to conifers and not to deciduous trees. They are not flowering plants. They also don't have any flowers. So yeah, that's that. So next up, we have some flowering plants. Now, these ones have very weird leaves, these U-shaped leaves. As far as I remember right, they're called this. And they are from the late Cretaceous. But we have some more flowering plants, and these ones, they're called Laurales. And there's actually 3 flowering plants that exist for most of the Cretaceous, so you can even use them for the early Cretaceous, as early as between 120 and 110 million years ago, which would include pretty much all Cretaceous animals we have in the game right now. I don't think there's anything older than that, except for maybe Guanodon, but that also existed later on. So, oh no, not these ones. So these Laurales, as well as these little fellas here, and these bushes here. So all of them have existed for most of the Cretaceous. And these bushes are very nice. They are very big bushes, which is pretty cool. So very nice for dense underbrush foliage. And they have these little flowers or berries, I don't know what they're supposed to be, at the tip of the branches. So very nice to use for all your Cretaceous and yeah, pretty much the Cretaceous settings. Just like these ones, these are also quite old angiosperms or flowering plants. And there's also versions with and without flowers, which I think is really cool. For like essentially the underbrush, the stuff that grows on the floor. These ones are very nice, as well as these trees. They come in all different sizes. Now these are from the tropical biome, both these Lauralis trees and these little shrubs here, while these are temperate. But you can use them generally interchangeable. So you can use these also for subtropical settings. And yeah, the Mesozoic in general is more leaning towards tropical. It's generally very warm compared to today. So this kind of makes sense. So when editing this video, I realized that I forgot a tree. Now these are platanids or platanids. These are similar to something like maple trees or plane trees. So they are related to them, or they are ancestors or whatever. And these were relatively common in the Cretaceous, especially the late Cretaceous of North America and Asia. These would have been some of the most common trees. Now, yeah, I've not a lot to say to them. They are temperate, of course. And they look very nice. They just look like your average deciduous tree. As you can see, they have this plane tree-like bark as well. And the leaves, some of them, which is interesting, as you can see here, some of them have the typical maple-like leaf shape. Even though, unlike maple, they do not have 5, they just have 3 fingers. While some of them look like normal leaves. So it might be that they start out as normal-shaped leaves, and then later on they are kind of forking out to these trident-shaped leaves, which is what I would assume. I don't assume that this is a mistake by the devs. I assume that this is deliberate and this is actually how these trees look like. So yeah, not much I can say about these, just that there are some nice trees. There's also small variants. Very nice looking. Now, another tree from the Cretaceous, or that can be used in the Cretaceous, is Metasequoia. So Metasequoia is actually also a modern genus. It's also called the Asian or Dawn redwood, I think, or Asian or Chinese redwood, as these are closely related to the other 2 species of redwood. And they are, of course, from Asia, not from North America. So I decided to re-record this bit because it was pretty confusing and I was also kind of misinformed. So these are the 3 species of redwood that are alive today and also that we have in the game right now. The first one is the genus Sequoia. This is called the coastal redwood, the Californian redwood, or just redwood. Now they have the typically red bark. And the leaves look like little palm fronds in real life. In the game, it's kind of hard to tell if they're supposed to be these just in a bit lower resolution, or they're supposed to be more needle-like, more conifer-like leaves. That's kind of hard to tell for me. But yeah, as you mostly view them from afar, that's not really an issue. Now the second species is the only species that can be found outside of North America, which is the species Metasequoia, also called the Dawn redwood or Chinese redwood, as they grow in China. These are the ones from the game. They have kind of the same leaves as the genus Sequoia, so the Californian redwood. As you can see here, they have these little like palm frond shaped leaves, like you see on something like yew trees or bolt cypresses and so on. So overall, these 2 trees are very similar, apart from the size, which we'll get to, and the reddish bark. So the bark is slightly red in Metasequoia, but not nearly as red as in Sequoia. And now comes the confusing parts, because the last species is called Sequoia dendron. So this is Sequoia, this is the Californian or coastal redwood. This is the species Sequoia dendron, which is also referred to as giant sequoia. And this is the confusing part that confused me, because in the game it's also called Sequoia, while this is called redwood, when in reality the one called redwood is the species Sequoia, And this one is the species Sequoiadendron, or the genus Sequoiadendron. Yeah, so this is what confused me initially, but apparently this is not a mistake by the game. This is just basically the English language being wrong, or not wrong necessarily, but different to the scientific name. So here we have the scientific name Sequoiadendron, but the common name Sequoia, and here we have the scientific name Sequoia, but the common name redwood. So this is kind of what confused me initially. Now these have also the very reddish bark, but the needles look more like typical conifer needles, like your typical cypress needles. They are relatively long as well. Now, the only thing that the game gets wrong is the size. As you can see, this is the standard size, like 100% for all of these. As you can see, these two are kind of the same size, while the redwood, the coastal redwood, is a lot smaller, or not a lot, but slightly smaller. Now, if we look at the actual sizes, and I adjusted these trees to their actual sizes, we can see how much the game underestimates this. So, a metasequoia actually can reach sizes of about 40 meters to a max of 50 meters. So this is 40 meters. Sequoia, so the Californian redwood, can reach sizes of about 120 meters. So this is by far the tallest trees that exists today. And Sequoiadendron, the giant redwood, can reach sizes of about 80 meters. But because they have these very thick trunks, they are much heavier, so they have a much greater mass than the other species. So Sequoiadendron, the giant sequoia, is considered the largest living organism on Earth. So yeah, that was just to clear that up, that the redwoods in the game are a bit weird. But that doesn't matter because you can rescale them, and from afar you don't really see how the leaves look. And you can also just use the metasequoia. Again, this tree, should have said that, looks absolutely amazing. One of my favorite conifers in the game at this point, especially for all kinds of Cretaceous environments, especially those that have a lot of water, like coastal and wetland environments. These, and even tropical ones, I guess, or subtropical ones, these are very nice, not just for arid environments. There's also a variant that has dry leaves, because these will shed their leaves in the winter when it gets too cold or when it gets too dry. Yeah, just like bold cypresses as well. So that's a very nice detail that we have these. Now, the last big tree on this list that isn't really arid is this one. So Agathis is a genus from New Zealand. And the interesting thing is they have leaves, but they are conifers. So they're related to Araucaria, or they are Araucaria. And they have leaves, which was just baffling to me, because they just look like deciduous trees, but you can see the little pine cones, or these conifer cones. Yeah, very amazing tree. They look absolutely amazing. Like this in between conifers and deciduous trees. Of course, they aren't. They are conifers, but they look a lot more like typical tropical deciduous trees. So these are very nice to use. These can also be used throughout pretty much all of the Mesozoic, as they are Araucaria, which have been around throughout pretty much all of the Mesozoic. So yeah, pretty nice plant to have. Also a lot of different sizes. That's awesome. Now, moving on to the wetland plants, there's a few that we have to talk about here. Most of these are really only useful for the Cretaceous. Now, first of all, these two. These are ferns. I don't think it's clear whether these would float on the surface, which the game seems to suggest, or they would grow in shallow water, kind of like reed or cattails. And I think they have only been found in the late Cretaceous. But since they are ferns, they might have existed before, so you might be able to get away with them in the early Cretaceous or even Jurassic, because at the end of the day, they're just ferns. And ferns have been around since before the Carboniferous, so yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that. This stuff looks like a mixture between duckweed and clover. But it's also ferns. Yeah, I couldn't believe that either. These ones are ferns. And sadly, you don't see anything that's under the water. So they also, most of these also have roots, especially these lotuses here have very long ones. But yeah, most of the plants have these long roots. I really hope they will fix this bug soon, that you don't see anything below the surface from above the surface. Again, it just disappears. But I'm sure they're aware of this, so I hope they will fix it soon. So yeah, this stuff, it looks like clover, but these little curled up twigs here are a bit of a giveaway, as this is typical for ferns. So these ones are actually ferns, which was just baffling to me. But they are also from the Cretaceous. I don't think they have existed before the Cretaceous. Maybe the late Jurassic, you could get away with these. But apart from that, yeah, pretty much only Cretaceous. The same also goes for these ones. These have been around since the early Cretaceous. So yeah, that's something like a lotus or something like a lily pad. The amazing thing is just about these how good they look. This is one of the best looking lily pads or lotus or whatever that I've seen in video games as a whole. Like if you compare that to the old lily pads that are now under the gardening tab, just look at the difference here. Not looking at the size difference, but just as the difference in appearance. Look how these are just flat surfaces. They're just flat PNGs. And these ones, first of all, have such a high resolution. Then they have this glittering effect, like they're wet, or they have these very leathery leaves that reflect the sun. And they also have this 3D appearance. You can kind of see it from the side view, how they are a bit 3D. So for pretty much the whole Cretaceous, so these have been around since the early Cretaceous as far as I know, also like 120 million years roughly. For all that time you can use these, like for example the Namek formation, Teutonicus is what I'm thinking about here, and maybe future Spinosaurs as well, I guess, and maybe future semi-aquatic species from the Cretaceous. Yeah, this is absolutely for them. They are absolutely beautiful. One of my favorite plants in this update. We have two more floaters, which ultimately look very similar. They both have this radiant appearance from a center on with little leaves. And they are also both from late Cretaceous Asia. So you would also find stuff like this in the Namek formation. So yeah, late Cretaceous Asia aquatic environments. Now, next up, we have something from the earlier Mesozoic. Now, these are, of course, horsetails. And they are a specific genus that has been around for mostly the Triassic and the early Jurassic. But considering horsetails are just very, well, common in the Mesozoic as a whole, and they all look very similar, I think you can get away with using these after the early Jurassic as well. I mean, later horsetails and even modern species look extremely similar to this. So yeah, just go for it. We already, of course, have a horsetail species in the game, but this new one just looks so much better. If we just compare the two real quick, you of course see that, first of all, the attention to detail, the level of detail is just much higher here. If you just look at the resolution here and compare that to this, it's kind of obvious how these ones look just infinitely better. So I will probably only be using these ones, and maybe I will use these ones as kind of the underbrush, where they're not so prominent. What's also cool is, what always bothered me about these horsetails is that they have these big clusters. Now when you try to build large areas covered in horsetail, you always end up with a very sharp edge. So right now, if you look at this cluster here, it just suddenly stops at the edge. Okay, there's horsetails, a lot of them, and then suddenly there's no horsetails at all. And what you would need is some single individual plants that you can use here and there to thin out this whole area. And this is what you can do with these new ones, because this one cluster is, first of all, relatively small in on itself, but some of the individual plants are also quite short. And if you submerge it into the ground, you end up with just 4 plants, 4 individual plants. And you can very well kind of fade out these horsetails very nice. So yeah, these are very useful for pretty much, especially the Triassic, but pretty much all Mesozoic wetland environment. So moving on from the wetland, we get to the more arid climate, like the shrubland, desert, and grassland. Now in the shrubland, we of course have these trees. These are also a type of conifer that is extinct by now. They have been around from the Cretaceous onward and throughout most the Mesozoic, or pretty much all of the Mesozoic. So these trees are perfect for arid environments throughout the whole Mesozoic, whether it's the Triassic and stuff like Coelophysis, or the Cretaceous with stuff like Velociraptor, or even the Morrison Formation. These trees are perfect. They also look amazing. You can actually see the single leaves, so they also have a very high resolution. Ultimately, look relatively similar to the cypresses that we've talked about before. But yeah, that's that. You can of course also make them smaller. So yeah. But next up we have the Araucaria. Now, we already had an Araucaria in the game, which is this one, the Norfolk Pine, which is also an Araucaria. Now, the Norfolk Pine is still very useful, especially for Triassic and later on Permian settings, if we will ever get Permian animals. Because these resemble the earliest and most primitive conifers. So the conifers that were common throughout the Permian and Triassic would have looked very similar to this. So these are very important still for that, for Triassic environments especially. But throughout the Jurassic, conifers of that shape became more prominent. Now these ones seem to be a mixture between the Australian conifer, Bunya, just that they have the leaves more concentrated at the tip of the branch, and the Australian Volimi pines, which are also Araucaria as far as I remember. So it's kind of a mixture between that. Volimi pines, of course, have very sharp leaves. These ones do not have leaves. They have these kind of soft twigs that other Araucaria species have, but protruding outwards from the branch in all directions. Now, I personally would have also liked to have a monkey puzzle tree, like a classical Araucaria araucana, or the Brazilian one, or even a Punya, something like that. Maybe both of these. So these are Araucaria araucana, the Chilean Araucaria or monkey puzzle tree, are pretty much the most iconic Mesozoic trees for me personally. So I would have really liked to see those as well. But I guess we have to make do with this. And these one also, just on a side note, these look very, very good. So especially for most of the Jurassic, but also large parts of the Cretaceous, but especially like the Morrison Formation, these ones are must-have. Like the semi-arid type of tree, but even for the forest. Compare them with the, how were they called? The Elatides. These make for perfect Jurassic and Cretaceous forests. And especially the smaller ones that I have not placed here. The smaller ones also look very cool. They look a lot more like Volimi pines. Or just more basic Araucaria, more basal Araucaria. And I think they would also work very well in the Triassic, as they look more similar to these more basic Araucaria. So yeah, very, very nice tree. One long awaited. I guess I'm a bit biased because of Araucaria araucana being my favorite tree, the monkey puzzle tree. But still, nonetheless, these ones are very good looking. Now we move on to the smaller plants in the arid environment. First of all, we have these ones, and these are just very weird. Now, these are called Zametes. And the Zametes actually belong to a type of gymnosperm that is related to cycads, but they are not cycads. They look very similar to cycads, but they're actually called benetites. And yeah, you can see that they are not quite like modern cycads. First of all, they have flowers. They are not flowering plants, but they have flowers that have convergently evolved also millions of years before flowers even evolved. And they apparently also had a similar function, which is that of pollination. So that's very interesting. Compared to modern cycads, they also have these many branches, so they have this coal-like shape with branching out a lot, which is pretty cool. Even though the smaller ones do not have that, they look more typical like cycads. So yeah, these also would be common for most of the Mesozoic, especially for more arid environments, but they could also be found in more lush environments. Yeah. The same goes for these ones. Now, these are also Benetites. They are not cycads, but for these ones, I have to say they look very similar to some of the modern species of cycads that can be found, for example, in Australia or South Africa. Cycads today are all divergent of a relatively recent ancestor. So modern cycads are not really that prehistoric apart from their appearance, but some of them represent Mesozoic species very well, and most of them need a lot of water, though they will rather grow in moist environments, but some of them can survive in more arid environments. These ones look pretty much like that. You can also rotate them around a bit to make the fonts a bit more dense, or they grow more densely, like cycads do typically. So I think having these ones is very nice, as they are a typical arid type of plant from the Mesozoic, while most plants we had in the game so far wouldn't be from the Mesozoic or wouldn't grow in arid conditions, and stuff like that would have been very common throughout the Mesozoic in arid environments. These palm-like plants, whether it's cycads or benetites or whatever they're called. But yeah, something like that, to have something like that in the game finally, is really, really cool. We have another cycad. This one is from the Grassland tab. Now, these ones also have been around since the Triassic, so use them freely. And they're also a bit more resistant against having growing in drier climate, as is also indicated by these red leaves. Now, having these red colorations protect the leaves from the sun, which is a pretty cool detail. Like most cycads, they have these pine cone-like buds there that they use for reproduction. So yeah, there's also a single one, and then there's these big clusters. So for desert, half-desert, grassland environments, these are perfect. Now, grassland is a stretch because grassland doesn't really exist throughout the Mesozoic as grasslands. So in the sense that we actually have grass, like you would... I'm in the tab. Like if we would place grass, this type of grass that covers very large areas that we have today, does not exist in the Mesozoic yet. It has only evolved afterwards in the, I think, Eocene. So grassland doesn't really exist in the Mesozoic. So grassland and shrubland are pretty much synonymous when we talk about Mesozoic environments. So yeah, but these are very nice plants for more arid conditions. Then we have these ferns. These are also open plain plants. As you can see, they also have these reddish fronds, some of them. So they do very well in open environments. Maybe not as arid as the cycads, because ferns generally do not do so well in arid conditions, but probably more than your average fern. So for shrubland and something like the Morrison Formation, these ones would be very, very useful for open areas. Because again, there was no grass, so stuff like ferns, horsetails, cycads would have, or later on the Edephra, which we'll talk very soon, would have covered large areas, open areas without trees. These ones are also ferns, and these ones are just very weird. But yeah, there's a large variety. They're actually related, so these two ferns are actually related. They also exist today. They're just very weird. They would grow in a different number of environments, from semi-arid to very wetland-ish environments. So you can use them relatively freely. I think they also look a lot like these early vascular plants you would see in the Silurian and Devonian. So whenever we will get more earlier animals, like we know we will get a Tiktaalik, but maybe we'll even get something more ancient, like, I don't know, trilobites or whatever, in an exhibit, of course. These would be very useful for these very early land environments, because they just look so weird, so alien. Especially these smaller ones, especially this one, which has less detail. It just screams alien world, or just plants that have recently covered the land. Moving on to our desert plants. Now, first of all, we have the Welwitschia. Welwitschia, or at least something related to the Welwitschia, Now, the modern Welwitschia grows in only a small part of South Africa, Namibia especially. They're very well adapted to dry environments, to the point where they will completely dry out and wait for the rain or the moisture of the fog. Real-life Welwitschia look more like this when they're young, so they only have 2 leaves. So from the center, as you can see, the center is kind of split here, like a mouse with lips, kind of. And they have 1 leaf growing from each side. And sometimes these leaves will split off and actually look like they are more than 2 leaves. But real Welwitschia, modern Welwitschia species, only have 2 leaves. Now, as you can see, these ones have more than 2 leaves. And also they will grow a bit more erect. So a bit more similar like aloes or agaves, which are your typical desert plants. So yeah, these prehistoric species might have been a bit more diverse. So again, this is pretty much how a real Welwitschia would look like. But again, we're talking about not the modern species, but a prehistoric species, so I guess that's fine. But a very nice plant for desert environments. It looks very desertish, especially with the ones that seem to have been dried up and have given up and just laying there. So yeah, finally a nice desert plant. And now we move on to the next desert plant. Now this is called Ephedra. It's actually related to Welwitschia. It is also a gymnosperm and part of the group that's called, I think, Gnathides or something like that. So they are order within the gymnosperms, within the seed plants. These are also adapted to more arid environment, but they will also grow in something like the formation that Uranus is from. I think it's called the Ischian formation, but I don't know how to pronounce that. Or the Ischian formation, something like that. But yeah, they would have also been present in colder climate. Now, both of these plants have been around for most of the Cretaceous. So when it comes to Cretaceous environments and Cretaceous deserty environments, these ones are very useful. But I don't think Ephedras have been around probably since the Jurassic at least, even early Jurassic. I don't think Welwitschias have, but maybe something similar to them has. I mean, gymnosperms were kind of diverse during the Mesozoic. And considering how similar stuff like cycads, if we look at cycads that look a bit more like this with singular leaves, they ultimately look very similar to each other. So maybe there's something in the even Triassic or Jurassic that these Welwitschias could proxy for, or that would have looked very similar at all. Now the Ephedra are probably the only plant in this update that I do not like, or I do not like the appearance of them. If we look at real-life Ephedras, they look quite different. They generally have a lot of very densely growing twigs or leaves, whatever they count as. They're kind of an in-between between twigs and leaves, as they're green but are not really flat like leaves. While the one in the game is not that dense, and also in real life they generally tend to grow upwards, so they're all very parallel, so they grow and then they curve upwards, which is not what these in the game do. Now, the best I've made of them is by using this smallest variant, stretch it out a bit so it's a bit more erect, and then copy and rotate it a bit. These are several in one, so this is how to make them a bit more accurate. I don't know why they went for this design when most modern and extinct species of Ephedra just look a lot different to this. Now, they seem to be based on a fossil from Brazil that I found online, which has these buds at the end of the twigs, which most Ephedra species today do not have. And they also have this fork shape with 3 or 2 twigs branching off from a center. Again, I'm not the biggest fan. I mean, even the reconstruction of this fossil I'm referring to looks a bit more similar to the modern species than this one. I still think you can use this a lot as shrubs. Basically anywhere where you do not want to have a lot of focus on, where you just want some area covered. You can just get away with these. as they are just very versatile. They look a lot more like your typical modern desert shrub that would, of course, be an angiosperm. I think the easiest version is to just proxy them, but I will get to that because I just realized I forgot a plant. So, of course, forgot the coal ferns. Now, today, these mostly grow in tropical environment, not in arid environment. In the game, they're said to be shrubland, so I guess you can use them in more open environments. They were also much more diverse in the Mesozoic. This genus specifically has been around since the Triassic, so you can use them for stuff like Coelophysis and Plesiosaurs and all other potential animals from the Triassic might get. We don't know yet. But yeah, also a very nice fern for large areas. So these will be basically a shrub. Basically, I mean, they're shrub, I guess. But yeah, basically some type of bush that covers large areas. So these are very useful for that. So last but not least, I will show you... Oh, I forgot another plant. So these are, of course, cycads. This genus also has been around since the Triassic. It's very similar in appearance to a modern genus of cycads, which it's not related to, at least not directly. But yeah, this genus has been around since the Triassic. It looks very much like a cycad. So this and the other cycad that's not a cycad, but these ones here in the back, that are actually benetites, I like the core cycad appearance, at least to me. Especially the smaller one here that is very dense, that has a lot of these fonts. This is pretty much, I mean, you can rotate it around a bit to make it even more dense if you want. But yeah, this is pretty much how I imagine cycads. Now, these wouldn't grow that well in too arid environments, but semi-arid, I guess, and also every other environment throughout pretty much all of the Mesozoic. So also a very nice plant here. I think now we have covered all of the new plants. I don't think I've missed another one. But let's move on to the desert I built here, just so I can show you what exactly I mean. Now, we've talked about these at the beginning of the video. These are the Arthrotaxites. But in appearance, they generally resemble the ephedra more than the actual ephedra. So just as a comparison, this is the ephedra. This is the Arthrotaxites. And now if you compare both of these to the modern species of ephedra that we have, and even most fossil ones, as I said, they look more similar to this conifer than they look to the in-game ephedra. But yeah, that's just my thought on the paleoflora. Again, pretty much the most important update this game has received. And I will play Prehistoric Kingdom a lot now. So, thank you for watching. Enjoy playing the game. I will do so too. And definitely make sure to check out the Paleobotany Guide by Teutonicus on Steam if you want to build accurate paleo environments for your desert, or your dinosaurs in general. And see you hopefully next time. Bye bye.